In this session, we will discuss why appropriate technology, which had become a centerpiece of development policy, began to decline as an idea by the early 1980s. To start, let's remind ourselves why appropriate technology had gained popularity. Without reiterating all the details from the last lecture, let me highlight three reasons for the rise of appropriate technology. First, rising unemployment and underemployment in developing countries had posed a real threat to the political stability. Appropriate technology provided at least an interim solution to this problem, raising hope that employment and income could be generated directly at the bottom. Second, by early 1970s, both the developed as well as developing countries were facing increasing fiscal deficits, which required slashing of government spending. Hence, the appropriate technology approach, with its appeal for low-cost strategies, was especially attractive to policymakers. Third, the appropriate technology approach did not call for major political changes because it was supposed to be apolitical in nature. Therefore, it was accepted by many governments, including even military governments. The approach became so popular that many developed countries' governments, including United States, Germany, and the Netherlands, created specific departments to promote appropriate technologies. By the early 1980s, there were over 1,000 organizations worldwide dedicated to appropriate technology initiatives. So, what led to the decline of this popular model? For one, the impacts, both economic and political, of appropriate technology projects were insignificant. Neither did these projects significantly increase employment nor income for the poor. One reason why income at the bottom could not be generated was that many of these countries were facing severe macroeconomic problems. The understanding that the micro and the macro economies are intricately linked was ignored by the proponents of appropriate technology, who saw such linkages as conduits for siphoning off surplus from the bottom to the top. Moreover, the products created with appropriate technologies did not function well, and hence the demand for such products was very limited. The cost of production was much higher than anticipated. The emphasis on local knowledge and local production had not raised much awareness regarding official supply chain for appropriate technology production. Another reason the higher than expected cost of production and distribution was not anticipated was because the proponents of the appropriate technology movement did not seriously take into account the business side of the whole effort. Instead, they were more interested in the social aspects, such as building solidarity, reciprocity, and community among the poor, which they saw as more important goals than profit-making. Politically, alternative technology projects did not have much impact either. Even though appropriate technology was seen as a tool to empower the poor, in reality, these projects did not address structural issues such as ownership and distribution of assets. Precisely because these projects were based on the assumption that mainstream political process was anti-poor, no efforts were made to get the support of the major political parties for these projects. As a result, the poor were often much more vulnerable to exploitation by the politically connected elites. You may remember that non-governmental organizations were to play a leading role in fostering development from below through the use of appropriate technologies. Let me recap the important assumptions regarding such organizations. First, non-governmental organizations were considered more efficient in use of resources than the government. In reality, however, they relied heavily on voluntary work actually did not turn out to be as efficient because their operations were very labor intensive and time consuming. If the cost of such unaccounted for labor were incorporated into the price of the product, it would rise manifold. Second, non-governmental organizations were supposed to be more equitable. In reality, they had to respond to the demand of the donors to show quick results. To achieve such results, these organizations did not focus on the needs of the poorest of the poor, because showing positive result for such groups at the bottom is much harder. Third, non-governmental organizations were supposed to be more accountable and flexible in their operations than the government. Research showed that these organizations were in fact more flexible, but to be more flexible than government, they had to break rules that government bureaucrats were obliged to follow. Fourth, even though non-governmental organizations preached the virtues of cooperation, a majority of them did not cooperate with each other. Because to preserve funding, they had to demonstrate that their organization had the capacity to deliver results without anyone's help. As a result, the scale of action of NGOs remained small, while the problem of poverty kept spreading. A few did expand on their own, but as they became bigger, they lost their competitive advantage of being small. By the early 1980s, as early appropriate technology-based projects were showing signs of structural weakness, one particular economic upheaval that really hurt their diffusion was the international debt crisis of the late 1970s, sparked by sharp increase in interest rate by the US Federal Reserve Board. The debt crisis marked the beginning of a new international economic regime underpinned by neoliberalism. This meant drastic reduction in recurrent and capital budgets of governments, which meant lesser funds for public expenditures. Also, for developing countries, it emphasized the need for increased export earnings, which was necessary to pay back the debt. This led to a turnaround for national economic policy for fulfilling the basic needs of the poor to export earnings. Neoliberalism also required opening up of the national economies to international competition. These too hurt the fundamental tenets of appropriate technology movement, such as self-reliance, and it hurt many of the businesses built on the appropriate technology model, as they could not compete well with cheap, mass-produced products imported from developed countries. Let me be clear, appropriate technologies were never taken very seriously by developing country governments, which aspired to industrialize despite economic and political problems. Many developing countries perceived the appropriate technology model, which are pushed by donor agencies, as lowering the standard of development. However, facing growing unemployment and the possibility of social unrest, they decided to accept it as a temporary measure, hoping that eventually they would be able to industrialize much like the industrialized countries.